In this heartwarming story, a waitress's small act of kindness transforms the life of an old veteran and sparks an unexpected ripple of gratitude. But what happens when the veteran's family discovers her secret? Will their response leave her regretting her generosity, or will it change her life forever? Subscribe now, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we celebrate the power of kindness and community. The soft hum of chatter filled the diner as Emily slid a plate of scrambled eggs and toast onto the counter. She gave a quick smile to the older man sitting at his usual stool, his Vietnam veteran cap tilted slightly forward, as if shielding him from the world. Frank barely looked up, just offered a polite nod and a mumbled, "Thank you, miss." Emily had worked at this small-town diner for years, and in all that time she couldn't remember Frank ever ordering anything but the same simple breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, and black coffee. He always sat in the same seat at the counter, never lingering longer than necessary. Despite the regularity of his visits, he remained a mystery to her, and to everyone else, it seemed. She couldn't remember forever dabbing at the fridge in the kitchen while making some coffee when she noticed something strange. A cloth hanging hidden in the corner. She wiped her hands on her apron as she glanced at the register, where she knew Frank would soon shuffle to pay. Emily bit her lip, hesitating before making her decision. She waved at her manager, Martha, who stood by the coffee pots. "Hey, I've got this one," Emily said quickly, sliding a $5 bill from her pocket. Martha raised an eyebrow. "That's the third time this month, Emily. You sure about this?" Emily nodded. "Yeah, I'm sure. He served, you know. It's the least I can do." Martha didn't argue. She handed Emily the receipt and watched as Emily quietly rang up the meal under her own tab. It wasn't much, just a small gesture, but Emily felt a warmth in her chest every time she did it. She didn't know much about Frank, no one did, but something about his quiet solitude struck her. He reminded her of her late grandfather, who used to sit on the porch with the same faraway look in his eyes. When Frank reached the register, Emily handed him the receipt with a casual smile. "You're all set, Frank." He blinked, clearly confused. "What do you mean?" "It's on the house," Emily said quickly. She didn't want to explain too much or make him feel uncomfortable. "We like to take care of our regulars now and then." Emily followed her boss out of the harbor door. Frank hesitated, his brow furrowing. For a moment it looked like he might protest, but then he simply nodded, murmuring another quiet, "Thank you," before heading for the door. Emily watched him leave, the door jingling softly as it closed behind him. She exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She knew Frank didn't have much money. His clothes were always clean but worn, his boots scuffed and patched. Maybe he didn't need her help, but something told her he appreciated it. And even if he didn't, she wasn't doing it for recognition. Later that afternoon, when the lunch rush had settled, Emily leaned against the counter with her cup of tea, glancing at the small stack of newspapers left behind by customers. As she flipped through one, an article caught her eye, a local story about veterans struggling with isolation after their service. Her eyes scanned the words, and she thought of Frank. "How long has Frank been coming here?" Emily asked Martha, who was refilling the salt shakers at a nearby table. "Oh, years," Martha replied without looking up. "He's like clockwork. Same time every week, same order. He's polite, keeps to himself." "Does he have any family?" Emily pressed. Martha shrugged. "Not that I know of. But you'd know better than me. You're the one always chatting with folks." Emily wasn't satisfied with the answer, but she let it go. If Frank had family, they certainly weren't around often. Maybe that was why he always seemed so alone. "Emily feel lost," said Frank, for he had better sense of direction. The next week, Emily paid for Frank's meal again, and again he accepted it with a quiet "thank you." The week after that, she did it again. Each time, she made sure to keep it casual, brushing off his questions with a warm smile and an easy excuse. Over time, Frank began to linger just a little longer, exchanging a few more words with her before he left. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Emily feel like she was doing something meaningful. What she didn't realize was that Frank wasn't the only one paying attention. One afternoon, as Frank left the diner, Emily noticed a man sitting in the corner booth watching her. She recognized him vaguely as one of the men who occasionally picked up takeout orders. He seemed to be in his early 40s with a strong build and sharp eyes. When she caught his gaze, he nodded slightly before returning to his coffee. Emily didn't think much of it at the time. But later that day, as she closed up the register, she found herself wondering who the man was and why he had been so interested in Frank. The bell above the diner door chimed as Frank entered, his steady gait bringing him to his usual spot at the counter. Emily was already there, her warm smile greeting him like clockwork. "The usual, Frank?" she asked, the pen poised above her notepad. Yeah," he murmured, pulling off his cap and placing it neatly beside him. "Thanks, Emily." Frank wasn't much of a talker, but his tone had softened in recent weeks. Emily noticed how he lingered a bit longer now, sipping his coffee slowly and occasionally watching the goings-on around the diner. As Emily moved to place his order, her co-worker, Lisa, nudged her with a sly grin. "You're like his guardian angel or something. What is this, the 4th week in a row you've covered his tab?" Emily shrugged, brushing off the comment. "It's just breakfast, Lisa. Besides, he deserves it." Lisa arched an eyebrow. "I don't know many waitresses who'd spend their tips on a customer every week. You're something else." Emily waved her off with a laugh, but deep down, she knew Lisa had a point. Frank's quiet gratitude made it worth it, though. She couldn't shake the feeling that he needed this more than he let on. As Frank's plate slid onto the counter in front of him, Emily noticed the man from the corner booth again. He was back, sitting in the same spot, his eyes flicking between her and Frank. He didn't seem threatening, but his presence was impossible to ignore. Curious, Emily approached him after refilling Frank's coffee. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, her voice polite but probing. The man looked up, his sharp blue eyes meeting hers. "No, thanks. Just coffee." His tone was even, but his gaze lingered as if he was studying her. Emily offered a small smile before returning to the counter, but the interaction left her unsettled. Later that afternoon, as she wiped down tables after the lunch rush, the man stood up to leave. He passed by the counter, pausing just long enough to drop a business card in front of Emily. "If you ever want to know more about Frank," he said quietly, "call me." Emily stared at the card after he left. It bore a simple name, Matt Harris, and a phone number. Frank's son? She wondered, her brow furrowing. She didn't know much about Frank's personal life, but she hadn't seen any family members visit him before. The next week, Emily decided not to mention the card. Instead, she kept her routine, paying for Frank's meal and chatting with him when he seemed willing. But now her mind buzzed with questions. Why hadn't Matt approached his father directly? Why was he watching from the shadows? One evening, after her shift ended, Emily found herself holding Matt's card, debating whether to call. Curiosity finally won. She dialed the number, her stomach tightening with each ring. Matt answered on the 3rd ring. "This is Matt Harris." "Hi, this is Emily," she began, her voice tentative. "I'm the waitress at the diner where you've been, well, watching." There was a pause, and then Matt sighed. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable. I've been trying to figure out the right way to approach this." "What do you mean?" Emily asked, her curiosity piqued. Matt hesitated, his tone softening. "Frank's my dad. We've been estranged for a long time. I didn't know where he was for years, but I found out he'd been coming to your diner every week. I guess I've been trying to work up the courage to talk to him." Emily's heart ached at his words. "Why haven't you?" It's complicated," Matt admitted, but seeing how kind you've been to him, it gave me hope. I just don't know if he'd want to hear from me." Emily frowned, her protective instincts kicking in. "He's your father. Don't you think he deserves the chance to decide that for himself?" Matt was quiet for a moment before replying. "You're right. Maybe it's time." The next morning, Emily found herself watching Frank more closely. He seemed lighter somehow, as if a weight had lifted off his shoulders. She didn't know if it was her small gestures or something else, but it made her feel like she was doing something right. Later that day, as Frank left the diner, Emily noticed Matt sitting in a car across the street. Their eyes met, and he gave her a small nod. The pieces were starting to come together, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Something big was on the horizon, and she had a hunch it would change all their lives in ways none of them could predict. The diner bustled with its usual mid-morning crowd as Frank settled into his regular stool at the counter. Emily greeted him with her signature warmth. "Morning, Frank. The usual?" Frank nodded, his lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. "Morning, Emily." "Yes, please." He opened the portal to his bedroom and slipped inside. She followed. She scribbled the order down, her movements quick but practiced. "Coming right up." She adjusted her glasses, breathed deeply. As Emily turned to pass the order to the cook, the door chimed, and she instinctively glanced up. A man in his 40s entered, his resemblance to Frank unmistakable. Emily froze for a moment. It was Matt. This time he wasn't hiding in a corner booth. Instead, he walked straight to the counter and took a seat a few stools down from his father. Frank didn't notice him at first, his attention fixed on his coffee. Emily felt a nervous energy fill the air as she approached Matt. "Hi," she said softly. "Are you ready?" Matt nodded, his eyes flicking toward Frank. "I'll just have coffee for now, thanks." Emily poured the coffee and set it in front of him, her heart pounding. She leaned in slightly and whispered, "Are you going to talk to him?" Matt exhaled deeply, his hands tightening around the mug. "Yeah, I think I'm ready," Alex said. Emily nodded, stepping back to give him space. She busied herself with wiping the counter, but her eyes kept darting between Frank and Matt. It didn't take long for Frank to notice the man sitting nearby. His gaze flicked sideways, and his posture stiffened. "Matt?" Frank's voice was barely above a whisper, but Emily caught the tremor in it. Matt turned toward him, his expression a mixture of hope and hesitation. "Hi, Dad." The two men stared at each other, the noise of the diner fading into the background. Emily felt like she was intruding on a moment far too personal, but she couldn't bring herself to move. "What are you doing here?" Frank finally asked, his tone guarded. Matt straightened, his hands gripping his coffee cup tightly. "I've been trying to find the right time to see you. I didn't know if you'd even want to talk to me." Frank's brow furrowed, his weathered hands wrapping around his own mug. "After all these years, why now?" Matt hesitated, glancing briefly at Emily before meeting his father's gaze. "I heard you'd been coming here every week. I thought maybe you wanted to be found." His father's green eyes met his, and he directed them towards him. Frank scoffed softly, shaking his head. "You think this is about you? I come here because it's peaceful. No one bothers me." Matt winced at the sharpness of his father's words, but pressed on. "Dad, I know I've made mistakes. I should have reached out sooner. But I want to make things right." Frank's expression softened slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Why now, Matt?" he asked again, his tone less harsh. Matt hesitated, his voice lowering. "Because I didn't want to regret not trying. Mom wouldn't have wanted us to end up like this. It's too hard to continue living with regrets, love. Let's not get away with anything tonight." Frank flinched at the mention of his late wife, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for his coffee. Emily's heart ached for both of them. watching as years of unspoken pain hung in the air between them. The silence stretched, and Matt added, "I've been watching from the sidelines, Dad, but what really made me come here today was her." He nodded toward Emily. Frank turned his gaze to Emily, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Her," Matt nodded. "Emily, she's been paying for your meals, hasn't she? She didn't have to, but she did it anyway. She reminded me of the kindness Mom always talked about. The kind of kindness I'd lost sight of." Frank's eyes widened slightly as he looked at Emily, who froze mid-step, caught in the middle of clearing plates. "You've been doing that?" Emily's cheeks turned pink. "It's nothing, really," she said quickly. "I just wanted to show a little appreciation." The attendant explained as she pressed the button to return the music to previous play. Frank stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he gave a small nod. "Thank you," he said gruffly, his voice thick with emotion. Emily smiled, her own eyes misty. "You're welcome, Frank." Matt leaned forward, his voice earnest. "Dad, if she can care about you without even knowing you, then why can't I? Please, let me try to fix this." Frank sighed heavily, running a hand over his face. "It's not that simple, Matt." "I know," Matt said, his tone pleading. "But can we at least start with a cup of coffee?" Matt said. Frank didn't reply immediately, his gaze dropping to his hands. Finally, he nodded. "All right, we'll start with coffee." Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her as she watched the two men settle into a tentative conversation. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. As she turned back to her work, her heart swelled with hope. This was why she had started paying for Frank's meals, to give him something good, no matter how small. She never imagined it might lead to this moment, a bridge between a father and son. And she couldn't wait to see what happened next. The following week, Frank sat at his usual spot, but this time the atmosphere was different. Matt sat beside him, and while their conversation was subdued, Emily couldn't help but notice the subtle changes. Frank's shoulders weren't as hunched, and the tension that had seemed to radiate from him like a shield was lessened. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As Emily refilled their coffee, Matt caught her attention with a slight wave. "Hey, Emily, can I talk to you for a second?" She nodded, glancing at Frank, who seemed engrossed in stirring his coffee. "Sure, give me a moment." After finishing her round, she joined Matt near the kitchen, her curiosity piqued. "What's up?" Matt hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at his father before speaking in a hushed tone. "I wanted to say thank you for everything you've done for him." Emily smiled modestly. "It's really nothing. I just wanted to show some kindness." Matt shook his head firmly. "No, it's not. Nothing. It's the reason we're sitting together at that counter today. He never would have let me in if it weren't for you." Emily felt a blush creep into her cheeks. "Well, I'm glad it helped." Her face tightened. Matt leaned in slightly, his voice dropping even lower. "Look, I want to do something to thank you. Something that shows how much this means to us. Do you have a minute after your shift?" Matt turned a little to glare at the woman, her hands on his shift and his shoulder butting into hers. She leaned in slightly, returning his gaze. Emily's brow furrowed, unsure where this was going. Sure, I guess. Why?" "Me?" Matt smiled, a spark of excitement lighting up his face. "It's a surprise, but I promise it's worth it." Despite her curiosity, Emily agreed. When her shift ended, she found Matt waiting for her outside the diner. He opened the passenger door of his pickup truck, gesturing for her to hop in. "I promise I'm not kidnapping you," he joked. Emily laughed nervously, but climbed in. "You're really building up the suspense here." As they drove through the small town, Matt explained his idea. "My dad doesn't know this, but we've been reaching out to family, my sister, my cousins, They've all wanted to reconnect for years, but no one knew how to break through to him. You did that. Emily listened intently, surprised by the extent of Frank's family network. So what's the plan? Matt's grin widened. We're throwing him a surprise family reunion. But that's not all. We've been pooling resources to do something special for you, too. Emily blinked. Me? Why? Because you started this, Matt said simply. You gave my dad hope, and you reminded all of us what it means to care for each other. By the time the truck pulled up to a local community hall, Emily's heart was pounding. Inside, the space was a flurry of activity. People of all ages were decorating tables, arranging chairs, and setting up a buffet. Emily spotted a photo display being arranged on one wall, pictures of Frank from his younger years, many in uniform. Is this all for him? Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Matt nodded. Yeah. He has no idea. Emily helped where she could, assisting with centerpieces and chatting with Frank's relatives. They shared stories about him, how he used to be the life of every family gathering, how much he loved fishing with his kids, and how hard it had been when he pulled away after his wife's death. As the final touches were added, Matt gathered everyone near the entrance. All right, here's the plan. Emily's going to be the one to bring him here. He trusts her, so it'll work. Emily's eyes widened. Wait, me? What do I even say? Matt smiled reassuringly. Just tell him it's a coffee run. He won't suspect a thing. Ebb? Nerves buzzed through Emily as she returned to the diner the next morning. Frank was already at his stool, sipping his coffee and reading the paper. Morning, Frank, she said, keeping her tone casual. Morning, Emily, he replied, glancing up with a faint smile. So, I was thinking, she began, feigning nonchalance. We've got this new coffee place in town. Thought you might want to check it out. Frank raised an eyebrow. New coffee place? This one's fine by me. Or it's on me, Emily added quickly. Just to say thanks for being such a loyal customer. He looked confused. Frank seemed hesitant but eventually nodded. The drive to the community hall felt endless, Emily's heart racing the entire way. She parked the car and led Frank toward the building, her palms sweating as she opened the door. What? Surprise! The crowd shouted as Frank stepped inside. Frank froze, his eyes widening in disbelief as he took in the sight of his family and the decorations. His hand clutched his chest, and for a moment Emily worried the shock was too much. But then a wide smile broke across his face, and his eyes filled with tears. Matt, he said, his voice trembling, you did all this? Matt stepped forward, pulling his father into a tight embrace. We all did, Dad. But we couldn't have done it without Emily. Emily tugged him away with a sigh. Frank turned to Emily, his expression a mixture of gratitude and awe. You knew about this? Emily nodded, her own eyes misty. I just wanted to give something back. You've given so much already. Frank shook his head, pulling her into the hug. You've given me more than you'll ever know. Margot pressed her face into the pillows again. As the family reunion unfolded, Emily watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with joy. Little did she know, the biggest surprise was yet to come. The chatter of voices filled the community hall as Frank moved from group to group, reconnecting with family members he hadn't seen in years. His smile, once a rare sight at the diner, was now constant. Emily leaned against a table near the back, watching the scene with a mix of pride and disbelief. It was hard to believe this had all started with a single quiet gesture. Matt approached her with a plate of food in hand. Hey, you haven't eaten anything yet. You've been running around helping everyone. Emily took the plate gratefully. Thanks, but honestly, I'm just happy watching all of this. He seems lighter. Matt nodded, his eyes following his father as he laughed with a group of cousins. I haven't seen him like this since before Mom passed. You did that, Emily. Oh, right, Corey answered, as he adjusted his glasses, studying Matt as closely as he could. She shook her head modestly. "This was all of you. I just bought him breakfast." Matt smiled. "You keep saying that like it wasn't a big deal, but it was." Before Emily could respond, Matt gestured toward the microphone at the front of the hall. "We're about to start the speeches. You should come up there." Emily's eyes widened. "Oh no, this is Frank's day, not mine." Matt chuckled. "You'll see. Just trust me." Reluctantly, Emily followed him to the stage where a small podium had been set up. Matt tapped the microphone to get everyone's attention. The room quieted, all eyes turning toward him. "Thank you all for coming today," Matt began. "This reunion means more than I can say. It's been years since we were all together like this, and seeing Dad surrounded by his family again, well, it feels like we're finally whole." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Frank gave a small nod from his seat. "But," Matt continued, his tone becoming more serious, "none of this would have happened without one person. Someone who showed us what kindness really looks like, even when they didn't think anyone was paying attention." Emily's stomach flipped as Matt turned toward her. "Emily, would you come up here?" She hesitated, feeling every pair of eyes in the room on her. Matt gave her an encouraging nod, and finally she stepped forward, her cheeks burning. "This is Emily," Matt said, his voice steady. "She's the reason my dad is sitting here with all of us today. Every week she paid for his meal. Not for recognition, not for thanks, but just because she cared." The room erupted into applause, and Emily's embarrassment was replaced by a wave of emotion. She blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the warmth in the room. Frank stood slowly, walking up to the stage with his cap in hand. The room fell silent as he approached Emily, his weathered face etched with gratitude. "You didn't have to do what you did," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you did it anyway. You gave me more than a meal, Emily. You gave me hope. And that hope brought me back to my family." Emily's throat tightened as tears welled in her eyes. "Frank, I just wanted to do something small. You've given so much to this country. It was the least I could do." Frank placed his hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "It wasn't small to me." She muttered something indiscernible indeterminably. The applause rose again as Frank hugged Emily, and this time she let the tears fall. When they parted, Matt stepped forward with a small box in his hands. "We wanted to do something for you, Emily," Matt said, his voice loud enough to carry over the applause. "You've changed our lives, and we wanted to give something back." He handed her the box, and Emily opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a key and a small note. She pulled the note out, her eyes scanning the words. "To Emily, thank you for everything. This key opens the door to your new business space. We believe in your dreams as much as you believed in us." Emily's breath caught in her throat. What is this?" Frank stepped forward, a rare grin breaking across his face. "We heard you've always wanted to open your own bakery. Well, now you can." Her hands flew to her mouth as she looked from Frank to Matt to the rest of the room. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Matt said, his smile widening. "Just promise us you'll make the best pies in town." He smiled. Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Emily felt her heart swell to the point of bursting. This wasn't what she had expected when she started paying for Frank's meals. She hadn't expected anything at all. And yet here she was, surrounded by love and gratitude. Her simple act of kindness returned 100-fold. As the room erupted into cheers, Emily looked at Frank, his family, and the crowd of smiling faces. In that moment she realized that kindness, no matter how small, always had the power to create something extraordinary. The days following the reunion were a whirlwind for Emily. The small key that now hung on a necklace around her neck felt heavier than anything she'd ever owned. She hadn't visited the new space yet. Matt and Frank had insisted on accompanying her for the big reveal, but she already knew her life had changed in ways she could barely comprehend. Back at the diner, things carried on as usual, but there was a new energy in the air. Customers seemed to linger longer, sharing smiles and stories, as if the reunion had awakened something in the entire town. People began stopping by just to congratulate Emily or ask about her bakery plans. "Emily, you're like a celebrity now," Lisa teased one afternoon, elbowing her playfully as they cleared tables. "Think you'll still remember us when you're baking pies for the president?" Emily laughed, though her cheeks flushed pink. "It's not like that, Lisa. I don't know. I never expected any of this." Lisa smirked. "Well, whether you expected it or not, you deserve it." Later that week, Matt and Frank arrived at the diner to pick Emily up for the big reveal. Frank looked sharper than she'd ever seen him, wearing a pressed shirt and a smile that seemed to make him 10 years younger. Matt, as always, radiated quiet confidence. "You ready?" Matt asked as they approached her. Julie nodded. "Not even close," Emily admitted, grinning nervously. "But let's do it anyway." The drive to the new space was filled with light-hearted chatter. Frank shared stories from his time in the service, and Matt chimed in with memories of his childhood. Emily listened intently, touched by how much they were opening up to her. It felt like she'd become part of their family in a way she hadn't anticipated. When they pulled up in front of the small storefront, Emily's heart skipped a beat. The building was modest but charming, with large windows that let in plenty of light. A freshly painted sign hung above the door, reading, "Emily's Bakehouse." Her hands flew to her mouth as she stared at the sight. "You didn't?" she exclaimed, turning to Matt and Frank. Matt grinned. "We might have gotten a little ahead of ourselves, but we figured it'd save you the trouble of coming up with a name." Frank chuckled. "And don't worry. You can change it if you want, but I'd say it's got a nice ring to it." Emily blinked back tears as she approached the door. The key trembled in her hand as she slid it into the lock and pushed it open. Inside, the space was bright and airy, with freshly painted walls and the faint smell of sawdust from recent renovations. A counter lined the back wall, and there was plenty of room for ovens, displays, and tables. "I can't believe this," Emily whispered, running her hand along the counter. "It's perfect." Matt stepped up beside her. "We thought about everything you'd need to get started. There's even room for expansion if business takes off." Emily turned to Frank, who stood silently near the doorway, his eyes scanning the space. "Frank, I don't know how to thank you for this." Frank's gaze softened as he met hers. "You already did. More than you know." The weeks that followed were a blur of activity as Emily prepared to open the bakery. The entire town rallied behind her, offering support in ways she never imagined. Local businesses donated supplies, neighbors volunteered to help with setup, and her regulars from the diner promised to be her first customers. On opening day, the line stretched down the block. Emily stood behind the counter, her heart pounding as the first customers stepped inside. Frank and Matt were at the front of the line, beaming with pride. Frank handed her a small package as he approached the counter. "A little something to remember where you started," he said. Emily unwrapped it to find a framed photo of her and Frank at the reunion, surrounded by his family. Tears filled her eyes as she placed it on the counter beside the register. "Thank you, Frank," she said softly. He nodded. "No, thank you." As the day went on, Emily felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The bakery wasn't just a business. It was a symbol of everything she believed in: kindness, community, and the power of small gestures to create something extraordinary. Months later, Emily's Bakehouse became a staple in the town, known not just for its delicious pastries, but for its atmosphere of warmth and generosity. Frank became a regular fixture, often sitting at a corner table and greeting customers as they came in. Matt stopped by frequently, always offering a helping hand or a kind word. And Emily, she never stopped believing in the power of kindness. She continued to pay for meals at the diner, now with a little more means to do so. She made it her mission to give back to the community that had given her so much. In the end, it wasn't just the bakery that flourished. It was the lives of everyone touched by Emily's small act of kindness. And as she locked up the shop one evening, looking out at the bustling street, she knew one thing for certain. Her story was just beginning.